now comes kind of the highlight of our event. It's our keynote speaker. And I'm going to do a quick little introduction. Dr. Jeremi Suri holds a Mack Brown Distinguished Chair of Leadership in Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He is a professor in the university's Department of History and the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Professor Suri is the author of 5 different books on contemporary politics and foreign policy. In September 2011, he published a new book on the past and future of nation building. It's called Liberty's Surest Guardian, America's Nation Building from the Founders to Obama. Professor Suri's research and teachings have received numerous prizes. In 2007, the Smithsonian Magazine named him one of America's top young innovators in arts and scientists. His writings appear widely in blogs and print media. Professor Suri is also a frequent public lecturer and guest on radio and television programs. This is a very big honor for us to have him. I know some of you have seen him, a very dynamic individual. Please, let's welcome Dr. Jeremi Suri.
Thank you so much. Well, good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? Excellent. Now, I see a lot of people standing, and that makes me worry that they might leave, and I don't want you to leave, so come sit, please. There are plenty of seats here. Come on, who are the problem children who need to sit in front? This always happens. No one wants to sit in front. I'll try not to spit, I promise. Come on, come sit down, people. There are chairs in front here. I'm delighted to be here. I really am, because I love maps, and I'm going to talk a bit about that. I want to begin, though, by pointing out that I'm a historian. So already I learned more about maps and the new technologies in the 15 minutes in front, and I got a little sick from the Google Earth thing, so it was fun. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about the history of maps and the history of American policy with regard to maps. Before I do that, though, I want to thank Richard for bringing me here. For inviting me and allowing me to come. I want to thank Kathy Wilson. I don't know if she's here. She's the person who handled all the logistics. And I don't know, is Alicia Bogart here? Alicia, are you here? She actually runs this facility, as well as the AT&T Center on campus. And I always want to thank her, because she always gets me a table when I need one. There have been many occasions when I've forgotten about Valentine's Day or Mother's Day or something, and Alicia bails me out. So she's a crucial part of maintaining my family happiness. So if you meet Alicia, please tell her that I thanked her here. Okay, as I said, I'm a historian, and what I want to talk about today, and what I hope we'll have a conversation about, are the intersections between 3 things in my title today: nation building, history, and maps. Nation building, history, and maps. These are 3 of the most important elements of our society on a daily basis. If you read your New York Times or any news source, you see that on a daily basis, we are debating what are the things we can do to improve our nation at home. Water is one element of nation building, right? How do we provide the infrastructure for people to drink and conduct their lives on a daily basis? We're also dealing with this problem overseas on a daily basis, whether we like it or not. The future of the Middle East will be defined not by our bombs, but it will be defined by whether there are functioning nations built in places that do not have functioning nations now. We do not want to be the only people building those nations there. We have tried that and not succeeded as we wish we would, right? But someone has to do it. So nation building is at the center of our daily lives. So is history. Everything I just talked about has to do with history. I tell people you study history not because you're interested in the past alone, but because you're interested in the future. You look back to think forward. You look back to think forward. The only laboratory we have for the human experience is history. It's the only place we can find new ideas. It's where imagination springs. Every imaginative, creative, innovative person I have met has historical interests, because it's by looking back, looking at the alternatives in the past, the roads taken and the roads not taken, that we can think about new roads for ourselves in the future. New roads for ourselves in the future. So coming back to the wonderful discussion we had about water already, how could you think about the future of water in Texas without understanding the history of water in Texas, about understanding what brought us to the situation, the circumstances, the opportunities, and the challenges that we face today? So nation building and history go hand in hand. And then, of course, maps. Maps come in crucial ways. Too often historians, policymakers, people I work with in Washington, people you work with in Washington, don't think about the mapping element of what they're doing. Maps are not only tools. You know this, right? Maps are not only tools. They don't only help policymakers understand how to get from here to there. Maps are constitutive of policy. Maps define policy. Maps define identity. Because more often than not, the citizen, the voter, the policymaker, the business leader who is dealing with an issue that they want depicted in a map relies on the map to tell them what reality is. However, every map is only an approximation. Even the Google Earth map out there. That's still just an approximation, right? An actual one-to-one map would be impossible. Someone's going to correct me on that in this room. I've said this in many rooms. No one's correcting me. I'm sure there's someone here who's going to correct me. To be careful speaking to this kind of group, right? You all know so much more about this than I do. But a one-to-one map would be the actual reality, right? By nature, every map is an approximation. By nature, every map is an abstraction. By definition, every map takes reality and redefines it. People take action based on the maps in place of the reality. So the map defines their action. The map defines how they think about things. You can argue that one of the best ways to understand why people do what they do is to look at what they're using as their maps to define where and how they do what they think they want to do. And that's something I want to talk about today. Where did I put my clicker? Here we go. So the book I recently wrote is called Liberty's Surest Guardian. It's on this issue of American nation building, and maps play a large role in it. The book is not about maps per se, but it's about how Americans have thought of the future, how they've thought of their own world, and how they've thought about what political order should look like in places like Texas, as well as places like the Middle East over the last 200 years. The book, again, is not about maps per se, but maps are a key part of it. I put it up there because my publisher says I'm supposed to put up my book for everyone to see. So now you've seen it. Okay. So here are my three propositions for us today. Here are my three propositions for us. We all live in nation states. I'll explain in a few minutes what I mean by that. We all live in nation states. Political order defines who we are. It doesn't matter whether you believe in big government or small government. Government is part of who we are, right? Government is part of who we are. I don't have to tell you that in this room, right? You all know that, right? Nation states, governing structures, they're historical. They're historical. They were not created by some larger being. They were created by human beings in a particular time, a particular place, for a particular purpose, and they won't always look the same. They won't always look the same. We throw around concepts like democracy, capitalism, markets. These are great and important concepts, but they will change in their meanings over time. The political arrangement that we live in is a historical arrangement. I'll explain why that's important in a few minutes. These historical arrangements, number one, oh, they're all number one. I don't know why this happens. They're all so important. Equally important. Equally important. Nation states are mapping projects. This definition in the first one on the list of the historical definition of government and society, it is defined in maps. I'm going to make that argument for our society in particular. The United States existed as a map before it existed as a reality. And the map made the reality. The map made the reality. So nation states are mapping projects. And because they are historical and mapping projects, they are fragile. The maps can change. One thing we haven't thought a lot about yet, at least as policy people, maybe you have, is how the technology of mapping is not just changing the way we map, it's changing those other two things as well. It's changing who we are, how we think about our society, how we think about our relationships to one and another. I see this every day with my children who have only grown up, they're 9, well now 10 and 11, they've grown up in a world with GPS. They can't imagine having to go to an atlas and figure out how to get from one place to another. They see the world through a GPS iPhone window, right? Think how different that is from how we grew up seeing the world. Think how that affects not just how they get from one place to another, but how they imagine politics, how they imagine society, right? Their vision of going from one place to another is finding the shortest possible route on a GPS map. Whereas our vision, when I used to look at an atlas, when I drove across country as an 18-year-old, I looked at all the interesting places I wanted to stop. I thought about topography, right? An atlas gives you topography if you have a good atlas. GPS does not. GPS does not. It gives you a lot of other advantages, by the way. I'm not making an anti-GPS argument. I don't want to sound like a curmudgeon yet. But the technology, the mapping technology changes the way we define the politics. It changes who we are. It changes our identity. It changes our politics. We've only just begun to think about that. And you guys need to be part of that conversation. Okay, so this is not a historical map. I'll have some historical maps. But I put this one up to make a point. Another thing that's great about new technology is I don't have to carry around maps the way professors used to, right? And point at them. I'll have a picture of that as well. It's so much nicer now just carrying a little stick with these maps on it. Okay, you all are familiar vaguely with this, right? This would be the United States of America about the time of the Constitution, right? This would be the United States of America about the time of the Constitution, 13 colonies becoming 13 states, and then, of course, the territories. And notice, I always point this out to my students, we are the Viceroyalty of New Spain. The Viceroyalty of New Spain, right here. So when the founders created the idea of a United States, it really was an idea. This is the beginning point for my book. We presume there was a United States, and the founders came together and just put together a more perfect union for it, right? They weren't putting together a more perfect union. They were putting together a union. There wasn't one to start with. It was what James Madison himself called a perfect fiction. A perfect fiction. Here's how the fiction went. That there was a United States because there was an American people. There was an American people because there was a United States. There was a United States because there was a territory. There was a territory because there was a United States, right? No one actually, even in 1788, really referred to themselves as an American. This is startling to us. They were fighting the British, but they were fighting as citizens of Massachusetts, citizens of Virginia, citizens of South Carolina. They did not consider themselves Americans first and foremost. How could they? How could they, right? Yet, the whole notion of this government was that they were Americans. Where did they come from? Who were these people? Well, we know, because it's one of the most studied moments in history, as it should be, we know that the founders thought a lot about territory and maps. They thought a lot about territory and maps, and that's why I put this one up here for you, right? This was a small area, a very small area, and their argument was that it was unique, that the territory, despite the differences despite having slave and free states, despite having an agrarian economy and in some places a proto-industrial economy, that despite the differences, this territory made America special. Frederick Jackson Turner, a century later, would capture this with what was called the frontier thesis. How many people heard of the frontier thesis, right? And the frontier thesis was the argument that what made Americans Americans, what made us Democrats, what made us who we are, was the fact that we were in a land separated, thankfully, from much of the worst parts of Europe, the most threatening parts, and a land that was in surplus, so we could constantly make and remake ourselves. Freedom would come from land ownership. We've never actually really lost that in our society, right? We are more likely to own a home as Americans than people are in almost any other society, right? Home ownership is almost one of the bases of citizenship in so many ways, and how we define ourselves, right? The American dream is to own a home. The French dream is not to own a house, right? It's to have a little tiny apartment in Paris near a nice cafe, right? The American idea is to own a house, right? You've made it, right? You've made it when you own a house, when you have land, when you have territory, right? So this territory, and the way they envision it, is actually the territory that becomes the basis for the United States. And their argument is that these separate states are one. They had never been one. The British Empire governed them as separate entities with their own relationships to London. But they would now be one, and the territory, as mapped, would allow Americans to think of themselves. Americans came to believe who they were because they could come to see themselves living in a common territory. They could come to see themselves living in a commentary. Lest you think I'm making this up, it's at the most important document in American history after the Constitution. Still one of the 10 most important documents, Washington's Farewell Address. How many people have read Washington's Farewell Address? A few of you have. Okay, good. You should all go read Washington's Farewell Address. It's not that long. I have to say this, no one do it now, please. But go do it sometime. Go read it sometime. This is the most important document after the Constitution of the late 18th century, right? The true test of any system, any agency, any government, any business, is what happens when the founder leaves. This is the true test. Succession, right? I do a lot of work with CEOs and leadership programs, and they say to me almost uniformly, right? The most important job of a CEO is to prepare a successor. If you don't do that, you haven't done your job, right? So this is Washington's succession statement. 1796, he's not going to run again. He's done his 2 terms. He's exhausted. He's fed up. Don't think politicians only get fed up, and we only get fed up with them in the 21st century. This has been a phenomenon in American history forever. We always loved and hated our politicians. Or I should say, we've always hated our politicians, but then reelected them. It's a very strange thing about us, right? Washington's farewell address is all about maps, because he makes the argument that the Union of Americans, the territory they live in, and the institutions they're building in that territory are sacred. They are new, but they are sacred, and they are, here's the key part, larger than the individuals. So that he can move on, but unlike a king, his leaving should not change the regime. The regime should carry on. If you read the farewell address, you will notice he does not say the things that equivalent testaments say in Europe and China and elsewhere at the time. He doesn't say we're all Americans because we share the same blood, because we don't. He does not say we're all Americans because we have the same beliefs, because he knows very well they don't, right? Half are slaveholders, half are not slaveholders. They're very different beliefs. Many are Catholics in Maryland. Many are Protestants who hate Catholics in Massachusetts. There are Huguenots, there are Jews. It's a religiously diverse environment, right? He cannot say, as the French will, we all believe in the same things. We all believe in the Pope. He's not saying that, right? He can't say that. It is the territory, it is the mapped space that makes Americans Americans. It is the mapped space that makes Americans Americans. And this vision is a vision that I call nation state, that they called nation state, that we call nation state. What is a nation state? What does that mean? It means we are one people with one representative government in one territory. One people, one government, one territory. And the territory is crucial to that. One people, one government, one territory, right? And the presumption of representativeness that's at the core of this as well. That government serves us in this territory. Serves us in this territory. That's how you're an American citizen to this day if you're born here. Doesn't matter who your parents are, right? You just have to be born in American territory. You ever notice that? It's not blood. For Germans, it's blood. For Russians, it's blood and suffering. For Americans, it's territory. It's territory. It's where you are born. This is the center of our immigration debate, right? Because people are appropriately, like my parents who are immigrants, trying to come here so they can have their children here, right? Because the territory offers possibility. That's my story, right? I'm the child of immigrants from Russia and India. I'm an American citizen because I was born here. I was lucky enough to be born here, right? Thankfully, my parents had the sense to come here and have me here, right? This is the argument for territory and nation. This is a radical argument. The world in the late 18th century has very few of these kinds of governments. We are radicals. This has to be kept in mind. We are radicals. We've always been radicals. Americans are radicals. Why do people dislike us in the Middle East? Because we're radicals. Don't ever think otherwise, right? We go around the world and say people should vote for their own leaders and that they should determine what they do and dress how they wish and wear tattoos and all these things, right? That's radical. We are radicals. We are radicals. Our politics might sometimes be conservative. We are radicals in the world system, and we were certainly radicals in the 18th century, right? Radicals in the 18th century. Here's the amazing thing. We've mapped the world. We've remapped the world. We've played a crucial role in making more and more places look like us. So in the late 18th century, most people didn't think that they lived in a nation with a territory with a representative government. We know this. We've studied this. People who lived in Tours, outside of Paris in France, they didn't call themselves Frenchmen and Frenchwomen. They called themselves subjects of the king who lived in Tours. Right? Scots. Do you really think the Scots called themselves English or British? They still don't. Right? Most people lived under a ruler. They happened to be part of a community, and they happened to do a certain kind of work. This mix of a government, a people, and a territory, that mix that we take for granted is a radical innovation of us and to some extent the French Revolution and a few other things. The Chinese are the best example of this. Do you know that until the early 20th century they didn't have a word for nation? Because they didn't think of themselves as a nation. They had to invent the word. They imported it from Japan, right? They did not have a word for nation because they were subjects of the emperor who happened to live in Shanghai or wherever else, right? They were not defined by the nation. We, though, have been active in encouraging the world to see itself this way. That's actually what Washington says. The other famous part of the farewell address you might know. No entangling alliances. We should remember that. Americans should not, he says, should not entangle themselves with the problems of the old world, but, he says, this is what people forget, we should change the world. He's not talking about military force. It's what he calls the gentle hand of commerce and the influence of democracy, that the world should be organized like us. Washington's presumption is that the world will be better served when the world is mapped to look like us, when people come to define themselves as a nation and a territory rather than as a people living under a king, as a nation and a territory. And that's what's happened here. So in the late 18th century, almost no one calls themselves a citizen of a nation state. In the late 20th century, everyone does. It's the only way you count now, right? Why are some people represented at the United Nations and others not? Kurds are not represented at the United Nations. They're in essence running a state in Iraq right now. But they're not seen as a nation state. So they don't count. They don't count, right? Whereas Taiwan does count, because Taiwan's seen as a nation state, even though the Chinese don't agree to that. The world has moved in this direction. It has been remapped to look this way. And a lot of that work happened on our own territory. So the greatest challenge to the American experiment with mapping a nation state occurred in our own society, right? We're not the story of Germany or Poland where we're dealing with outside invaders. It's our own issue. And we should always remember that. I would say historically, our greatest foreign threats have always been domestic, which is to say the things we've done or not done at home. We are blessed with resources, land, wonderful people, and distance from a lot of the hot spots in the world, right? It's what we've done at home or what we've not done at home that's often been the biggest issue for our security. Civil war is the best example of that, right? The best way to see the Civil War is that it's a conflict over two different visions of political order that have two different maps associated with them. Two different maps. It's not just that the Confederacy in this 1861 Harper's map is making the argument that they are a different territory. They're making the argument they're a different system, right? They're a different system. Notice the latitudinal difference. It's so obvious, right? But it makes all the difference in the world in terms of economic order, in terms of the kind of production, the kinds of people you have. Their argument, their map, their claim is that they are a different part of the globe than the North, and that they should be a different nation. They are fighting to be a different system, a slave plantation system rather than a northern capitalist system. That's really what the Civil War is over. It's over economic order and the way that is mapped. Lincoln's vision, which wins, thankfully. Lincoln's vision is also a radical vision, right? Lincoln's vision, and I put this up for students so they can remember, even after the Civil War, how much of the United States was not formed into states, how much of it was still open territory. We forget that. We go very quickly from the Revolution and the early settlement and then the independence of Texas and the glory of Texas to then the United States of the 20th century. It's not true. Look at that. Look at the size of that space. Look at how much of the country is still, in a sense, unorganized. It's still being mapped. It's still being put into place. Lincoln's vision, the Republican vision of the 19th century, a party created on the eve of the Civil War, the Republican vision is of one contiguous, huge country, what Jefferson had called an empire of liberty, connected intimately through infrastructure and investment to become the largest market in the world. The Republicans of the 19th century, what do they believe in? Railroads. Investment by the federal government. Who invests in the railroads? Where does the money come from? A lot of it comes from the federal government, especially the land. Education, right? The land grant universities, right? We actually have two in Texas, right? One is a state land grant, the University of Texas at Austin. The other one, whose name I can't remember, in College Station, they are the federal land grant. They are the federal land grant. Education, infrastructure, investment, and here's the biggest one, high tariffs. High tariffs. The United States had the highest tariffs in the world in the late 19th century. People forget this, right? It's actually an interesting question. Where did the money come from for the federal government in the 19th century? Anyone know? There's no income tax, right? Everyone recognizes there was no income tax until 1912, right? Where does the money for the federal government come from? Anyone know? Yes, ma'am? Actually, it's a really good answer. So there's a lot of money that comes from alcohol taxes, but it's still not the majority of the money. But that's a good point. Alcohol taxes, we are big whiskey consumers, yeah? Where else? Where does the majority of the money come from? I'm sorry? Imported goods. It comes from the tariffs on imported goods. In the 1880s, the federal government has a surplus without having raised a penny of income tax because of the tariffs, because of the duties on imported goods, right? The Republican vision is to create this integrated market by taxing goods coming in, building railroads across, creating universities to train people to work in this environment, and investing in it. And investing in it. And if you don't think that's what Lincoln believed, go and read what Lincoln said. Lincoln was a poor, white farmer. For him, capitalism and the federal government offered opportunities. That's why he believed them. He was a bourgeois merchant, a lawyer merchant who believed that the federal government was to help provide individuals with opportunity. Individuals with opportunity. This was a map before it was a reality. This was a map. I have another one I didn't bring with me that shows the Transcontinental Railway, which is completed in 1869. It's one line that goes from Chicago pretty much out to San Francisco. There's not much there. It's imagined. This is my point. It's a map before it's a reality. This map is inaccurate. It's what I started with. It's an imagination that is going to remake the reality. Why is it an imagination? Because most of those areas in light green are not really under anyone's control yet. They aren't developed. They aren't integrated. They look like they're integrated in this map, but they're not. It's an imagined vision that becomes a reality. It's also done with new agencies. This is really important. Maps create new agencies. This is the first American Aid Society. The first time we do foreign aid is in our own country. Freedmen's Bureau, sent from the north into the occupied areas of the South to remake the South. One of the major things the Freedmen's Bureau does, as this image shows, it provides order, but the other thing it does, it maps. They document where people are. This was not well documented in the South. They build new roads. They make the South legible and integrate it into a northern map. This was the man who oversaw this, Oliver Otis Howard. Oliver Otis Howard, you might have heard of Howard University, named for him. Named for him, he was one of William Tecumseh Sherman's close friends and companions. And as is always the case, the map makers who often have the most influence are the map makers hired by the military, right? Military sponsors more map making after the Civil War than any other entity. And an important part of the story, by the way, is the education of young, formerly illiterate slaves to be readers, not just readers of text, but readers of maps, to know how to move around. One of the goals of the Union and the Freedmen's Bureau is to create mobility in the South, to get African Americans off the plantations and allow them to move, sometimes into these other territories, to build new lives and create new economic opportunity. The goal in the South is not integration. You all know this at the time, right? The goal in the South is opportunity and movement. So how are these African American kids in African American schools going to be able to move? They're going to have to learn how to navigate. They're going to have to learn how to read maps. They were prohibited from being map readers as slaves for this very reason. They will now be made into map readers as such. This story, this experience, is what takes the United States overseas. The best way to understand how foreign policy is made is not to try to think that foreign policymakers read lots of books and then decide what the best thing is to do. You know that's not true. Policymakers don't have a lot of time to read. What policymakers do is they take their own experiences from the past and generalize them forward. They take their own experiences from the past and generalize them forward. You've all heard this phrase, we're always fighting the last war. We're always fighting the last war. That's what policymakers do. They fight the last war. So when Americans started to think about a larger international system in the late 19th century, they looked to their mapping experience in the American South. They looked to think about many of the issues. And I love this map because it captures so much of what's going on in the late 19th century, right? It's the effort, you all know more about this than I do, right? It's the effort to use maps to capture more information, to put information together, and here's the key thing, to make a complex world simple and comprehensible. That's what this map is trying to do, right? It's showing where the United States is in relationship to Cuba, which is part of the Spanish Empire. It's showing where Cuba is in relationship to other islands, and then it's trying to integrate an understanding of the Philippines in this, right? Philippines is 8,000 miles away, but the Philippines is part of the Spanish Empire that's in control of Cuba. So this map is trying to make all that understandable. It also has a pretty accurate, from what I can tell, list of what ships the Spanish have, what ships the Americans have, right? It's trying to take all this complex information, right, and put it in one document so a policymaker can understand it, right? And that you can also move around on it, right? So you can move around on it. It is in this context that Americans changed their foreign policy. The challenge of the late 19th century was, how can you now be this nation in a world that seems to be getting smaller with more big nations coming close to you? That was the problem with Cuba, right? Cuba, this island 90 miles south of Florida, was part of the Spanish Empire. That was not threatening to the United States. But as the Spanish Empire was declining and the British and the Germans were beginning to move into Cuba and Mexico, that was a real threat to the United States. In addition, Cubans in large number were leaving Cuba to come to the United States to ask for American help. In addition, American investors, who by the 1890s own most of the sugar and tobacco plantations, are fearing that disorder in Cuba will undermine their access and control to this area. So Americans in the 1890s, and you can follow this in the documentation, have to rethink their map of the world. They are going, quite literally, from this to this. They're trying to understand how they fit into a larger world. They're trying to understand where they go, where they are placed. And this is the story of a new kind of war that will look very familiar to us, a war in the Philippines and in Cuba. That's what we would call today counterinsurgency, a counterinsurgency conflict. Americans arrive in the Philippines in 1899, 1900, to deal with a problem that becomes the problem of the 20th century. How do you operate far from the United States? This is the Philippines here. I want to say a little bit about this map in a second. How do you operate far from the United States? In a place where you feel you have to be to prevent worse people from coming in, but how do you create order so you can get out? Right? Isn't that what we struggle with? Tell people Americans are not empire builders in the sense that we want to rule other people. We want other people to rule themselves in ways that are compatible with our interests. We want them to rule themselves. That's the Washingtonian vision. That's what this map is about. Americans are figuring out how to deal with this problem. The Spanish are in Cuba. As we go to war with the Spanish in Cuba to deal with problems there, we find ourselves at war in the Philippines because that's where the Spanish Navy is. That's what this map is showing. This map is creating a reality. It's saying if you go to war in Cuba, you have to go to war in the Philippines. And the United States finds itself having to figure out what to do. What to do in this area. This is a map from the time also. This is extraordinary to me. This shows, I think, the power of maps. Because this is what policymakers were looking at. This map has 7,100 islands in it. That's how many islands there are in the Philippines. 7,100 islands. But you wouldn't know that looking at it, would you? It makes an area that had no real history of unity, where there was no common language, common religion, a set of dispersed islands, look like one single entity to Americans. A single Philippines. A single Philippines. I assure you, no one in the Philippines in 1898, 1899 thought of themselves as a single Philippines. They were nationalist activists who wanted to get the Spanish and then the Americans out. But the notion that this could be one nation like the United States, that it could have one representative government, that it could be one territory, is actually a mapping fiction. It's a mapping fiction. And anyone who's been to the Philippines knows that even to this day, it's still pretty hard to get from island to island. A lot harder than it was in the 19th century or it is today to get from one part of the United States to another, right? It's difficult to move around here, very difficult to get from one place to the other. Americans arrive in the Philippines thinking they're going to get the Spanish out and then leave. The idea is to disempower the Spanish Empire so that there are no other threats to the United States from Cuba or areas related to that where the Spanish Empire or its successors, the Germans or the British, might operate. The belief is that the Philippines should be free of empire so the United States will not be threatened by another empire in its own territory, in its own hemisphere. As Americans arrive, though, they face strong resistance, much more than they expected. This is the beginning of the story of the next century, of Americans arriving in an area that looks like it's ready for nationhood. We arrive, and those who want nationhood don't want what we want, right? We always have trouble with this, right? It's not that they don't want the other guys out, but they don't want us there. This is the story of the Taliban in Afghanistan. Most Afghanis don't like the Taliban, but it doesn't mean they want us there either, right? How do you deal with this problem? The man who's put in charge of it is William Howard Taft. I know I can always take a drink when I put William Howard Taft in. It is so depressing. I give 2 lectures to undergraduates every semester on William Howard Taft because he's super important. But the only thing they ever remember is that he's the fattest American president ever. We are so prejudiced toward fat people, aren't we? It's terrible. William Howard Taft is a really, really important person for everything we're talking about. I'd argue to you he's more important than 2 other people you have heard about and know more about, named Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt. Woodrow Wilson was president for 2 terms and, of course, president during World War I. Theodore Roosevelt played a somewhat important role during the Spanish-American War, was a major public figure, and then president for a little less than 2 terms. So, yeah, they're important people, colorful personalities. This man, though, this man was the political operative of the late 19th and early 20th century. Solicitor General to the president, district court judge in Cincinnati, basically running Cincinnati, governor of the Philippines, governor of Cuba, secretary of war at the time, as it's called, president of the United States, and then chief justice of the Supreme Court. Over the course of 40 years, this man was at the top all 40 years. Not just for 8, 40 years at the top. He's the James Baker, right, of that period. Baker did it in other offices, but it's extraordinary if you know James Baker's career, how often he was at the top from Reagan to Bush. He's that kind of figure. And he's revealing of exactly what we're talking about today. He left so many letters, so many materials. There are 370 reels of microfilm at the Library of Congress with his materials. He wrote a 10-page letter home to his wife every day of his career, even when he wasn't traveling. He wrote a 10-page letter to his wife. I made the mistake of telling my wife that, and I got into a lot of trouble. Should never tell. Don't tell your spouses that he did this. That's how we know what he did. We have a great record of his life. So he's asked by McKinley, President of the United States, after we arrive in the Philippines, to help him figure this out. McKinley could barely find the Philippines on a map. McKinley was not deeply knowledgeable of the region. This is true quite often, right? We find ourselves operating in places we're not very knowledgeable of, right? We all understand that. Not many of us know much about Syria. Not many of us know much about Iraq. He doesn't know what to do. He brings in the man who has experience with politics and law in American society, a veteran of the Civil War who dealt with the Reconstruction issues in the South, who remapped the South to help him remap the Philippines. Taft tells McKinley in the White House, you made a mistake. It's one of those few cases where you can see someone telling a president to their face they thought the president did the wrong thing. Tells him, I was against going to war with Spain. I was against this war in the Philippines. But, Mr. President, now that we're there, we have to do something about it. Right? This will be a common issue, right? Whether you agreed with the war in Iraq or not in 2003, it became our mess, right? Whether we were for it or against it, right? It became ours. We owned it, right? That's what Taft was saying. And his argument was we must use our skills, particularly our technical skills, to make the Philippines a better place so we can live, so we can leave. On the one hand, that's paternalistic. It's imperialist. It's racist. He basically says our little brown brothers need us to get them ready to govern themselves. But on the other hand, it's also designed to do what he believes the Union had done to the South, that the Union had remade the Confederacy, what he believed the founders had done to an unsettled territory, to remake this territory, to remap it. And that is exactly what he does. This is a more fair picture of Taft from a Philippine source, not the stereotypical image. Taft goes over to the Philippines, and again, we have every day of his itinerary because he wrote home to his wife about it every day, so we know what he did. He went from island to island, as any good political boss would do, and met with all of the elite leaders. And he had a staff that quite literally remapped the Philippines. How do we understand where the resources are? We were talking about water before. How do we understand where the resources are? How do we know where the political power is? Where are the powerful chiefs? He talked to them as Indians. You know, where are the big Indian tribes? Who are the big leaders? How can we get them to work together? How can we build a common government? He redraws the system. And I don't want to go ahead too fast. In redrawing the system, he creates a new Philippines. It is not a Philippines without continued violence. It is not a Philippines that is equal and free. And it is a Philippines the United States is in through the 1930s, through 1941 when the Japanese arrived, though it was the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 34, which would have had the United States out by 44. So he does a lot of things that don't look equal or democratic. But what he is doing is building a common government and mapping it as never before. The first modern maps of the Philippines are made by Americans working for Taft, redrawing, redesigning what this place is. And as they're redrawing it, they're remaking it. That's the important point. As they are redrawing it, they are remaking it. How do we know that actually happened? Well, when the Japanese arrive in late 41 and early 42, they arrive and they tell the Filipinos, we are Asian liberators. We've come here to get the white man out. That's what they say. What do the Filipinos do? Anyone know? They say, no, we're part of that American system. Not that we want the Americans to rule us, but we are not what you think we are. We will fight for the Americans, not for the Japanese. And actually, the story of the United States getting back to the Philippines and Douglas MacArthur returning is a story of Filipinos fighting against the Japanese on behalf of the Americans. In fact, that happened throughout the southern part of Asia, right? And they fought in units defined by territories and maps made by Americans. This does not mean they loved Americans. They wanted us out. But it meant that their identity was redefined by the experience of being under Taft and then his successors' political leadership in this region. That experience, ladies and gentlemen, was the experience we took to Germany. The only way you can understand the remapping of Europe after World War II, and you all know this history, right? Europe looked very different before the Nazis, looked very different during the Nazis, and then very different after the Nazis. And the after the Nazi story is our story, right? The Americans who arrived there and did that work, they were not deeply knowledgeable of Germany, but they had been in the Philippines. That's the point. They had been in the Philippines. This man you might have heard of called Dwight David Eisenhower. How many people have heard of Dwight Eisenhower, right? Commander of America. Once in a while, I have a few students who don't raise their hand. And I just say, just raise your hand. Make me feel better. Eisenhower spent 10 years in the Philippines as Douglas MacArthur's assistant. It was the formative years in his career. And that, by the way, is why Franklin Roosevelt chose him to lead the D-Day invasion and lead American forces in Europe. Eisenhower was like the 7th or 8th on the list of priority and seniority to actually command. But FDR said anyone who could survive with Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines for 10 years could actually manage Europe after the war, right? Eisenhower's a pretty amazing person, right? The only man since William the Conqueror in 1066 to cross the English Channel successfully at war. Right? It's a pretty good thing to be able to say about oneself. He arrives in Europe with American forces after D-Day, and he self-consciously recognizes that he doesn't know what to do. We know how to beat the Nazis at this point. We don't know what to do about the future of Europe. It's a big problem. 3 huge problems, right? It all looks so easy now. 3 huge problems at the time. 1, what do you do with these economies that are completely destroyed? Completely destroyed. That's why I put up this image of one of my favorite cities in the world, Cologne. It's amazing by the that the Duomo, the central cathedral, survived. But look at that city. Americans have never experienced this. This is way, way, way beyond September 11th, right? Imagine one of our cities being bombed out like that, right? Beyond that, imagine 6 years of war where all the able-bodied people in your society, including women, have been maimed and destroyed. Maimed by the experience of war, maimed by the pressures of war production, maimed by the Russian soldiers who have arrived there first and raped them, right? Imagine that, right? Russian soldiers raped somewhere about 100 to 200,000 German women, right? Just imagine your society living through that, right? And imagine trying to get an economy going. That's problem number one Eisenhower faces. Problem number two Eisenhower faces, right, is still the Soviet problem. They're right there. You've got the problem of running the German economy. You've got the problem of the Soviet threat right there. And communism looks attractive to these people in these areas, right? Because what are the Soviets saying? You became fascist, and you went the wrong way because you were capitalist. Be communist like us, you won't be fascist. You won't have that problem again. The West, they're fascists too, right? Third problem, most significant problem. Americans believe that they're going to go back to a depression. That generation, right, some of our grandparents who lived through the Great Depression also was the World War II generation. The only experience they had of economic growth, if you grew up in the 1930s, the only experience of economic growth you had was in war. So you expected after war to go back to depression. It's the opposite of what our students now think. They expect, well, after we get through a recession, it's going to be prosperous again. iPhones for everyone, right? That generation expected the opposite, right? It was going to get hard again. Hard was normal. Hard was normal. They were not ready to go reconstruct this area. So the question was what to do. What to do? In 1947, Americans thought they couldn't do anything. If you read the cables, you read the political statements, overwhelmingly, Eisenhower and others say, well, you know what, we might consider just leaving now. We can't make this any better. In the winter of 47, the average German caloric intake is less than 1,200 calories a day. Most of us had more than that for breakfast, right? So what do? Well, President Harry Truman does what every good Democrat or Republican does, bring in someone from the other party to take the blame. So here we have Herbert Hoover. Hoover, of course, had been the discredited president during the Depression, but Hoover had been the hero of World War I. Hoover was, in the 1920s, the Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs of today. This was the great businessman. He was an orphan who became an international businessman who figured out a way to feed Europe after World War I. There are more high schools named after Hoover in Germany today than any American president because of the World War I experience. Hoover makes a map, figures out where are the important places. This is my version of his map we made for our book. Where are the places in Germany that are going to be the future of this society? And he goes and visits. And he does something extraordinary for a 72-year-old man at that time. Just think what it was like to be, prop engine planes and everything in this period, right? He goes over there and he meets not with American military leaders. He meets with local business people, local merchants, trying to figure out what is it that can get this society moving. He comes back and writes a report, Hoover does, that eventually, and it's a long story I could tell, gets taken up by the Truman administration and provides the basis for the Marshall Plan, which you've all heard of. In June of 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall, also a hero of World War II, announces that the United States will finance the reconstruction of Europe. It's not just financing and putting money over there, and here's some of the money figures, which are amazing. Overall, it's $13 billion. $13 billion in 1945 money. That's extraordinary, if you think about it, right? $13 billion. But it's not just that. Notice what this map is doing. It's creating a Western Europe and an Eastern Europe. The Marshall Plan recipients will be Western capitalist democratic societies. They have to be. It's the only way they get the money. We offer the money to the communists, but we tell them you can't have the money unless you open yourself to transparency and political participation, and you know exactly what answer that derives. No. So it remakes Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, the Marshall Plan, as well as then NATO and all of the military things that follow, there's no NATO yet. NATO's not till 1949. All of what follows remakes Europe. The European Union is built in this section. It's between France, Belgium, West Germany, right, creating a coal and steel union that creates the basis for a common currency eventually, for a common market, and for a common Europe, and a common Europe that includes the West, but does not include the East to the same extent. To go ahead very quickly, that's what Putin is talking about with Ukraine. He's saying Ukraine is not part of that. You made your Europe, I should have mine. I should have mine. We'll come back to that quickly. I want to say a little bit about Vietnam and then a little bit about Afghanistan. So, the experience of remapping Europe brings Americans to Vietnam. The way to think about the Vietnam War is an effort by Americans, because of the fear of communism coming to that part of the world, to remake the villages, the backward villages of Vietnam, into a modern, functioning, mapped society. That's what they're trying to do. In fact, that's what Robert McNamara is all about. It's wonderful to look back at these images of McNamara. You realize how different our technology is. You used to get press briefings like this with a pointer, right? But that's what he's talking about. Remaking Vietnam. The view was that this society, this small society, was behind. Because it was immodern, it was susceptible to bad influences. It was immature. Walt Rostow, who used to be a major presence here in Austin, Walt Rostow, a great economist, his argument was that societies go through development like teenagers. And they have these moments of adolescence when they're really susceptible to drug dealers and other bad things. And the communists are the drug dealers. So if we remake the society as a modern society, it will be mature and it will be free from the drug dealers. That's what they're trying to do. It does not work because unlike the other cases, their maps stink. Why do their maps stink? Because they make the maps in the way you never would. They make them from Washington, not from Vietnam. Right? They make them from Washington, not from Vietnam. It's the same problem we had in Afghanistan. Here's my view of Afghanistan. We arrived in November of 2001. We went through this extraordinary convulsion as a society. Everyone remembers September 11th, or what it felt like. Threats were everywhere. The world was coming apart. And then 2 months later, it looked like we had done the impossible. We'd overthrown the Taliban with a small group of special forces riding camels and calling in airstrikes from the air and carrying bags of money. And we arrived, our soldiers did, and Northern Alliance soldiers in Kabul around Thanksgiving, November of 2001, and we were greeted as liberators. We were liberating people from one of the most horrible regimes in the world. ISIS has now taken the lead as the most horrible regime in the world. But for a while, the Taliban was probably the most horrible regime in the world. But we didn't, as in Vietnam, and unlike the Philippines and Germany, we didn't establish the knowledge on the ground to make maps that would allow us to operate effectively. In fact, we didn't operate at all effectively. This is what it looked like to soldiers. This is what President Bush was seeing. But this was the reality. It took me a lot of time to make this map because collecting the data was really difficult, which is also interesting, right? This is where our forces were. The blue are our forces. We just left the whole society open. We went in and said, we're going to come here, we're going to help you. Whether we should have done that or not, we were there. And then we said, you know what, we're just going to hang out in Kabul with a small number of forces. 2007, we finally changed that a little bit. We finally changed that a little bit. We didn't understand the society we were operating in. It's not because there weren't smart people who could learn about this around government. It's that policymakers were not taking that in as they drew their maps of this area. And that applies to Republicans as well as Democrats. It's not one way or the other. This is not a partisan statement. I think it's a factual statement. It's a condemnation of our own society. Here's what's happened to us as a society. And it's because of maps, actually. Because we can get so much instantly, we often don't dig deeper. We don't ask what's really behind the data. What Bush was seeing, because I've read the documents, is he's getting all the data on people who are greeting American soldiers. But he's only getting it in a few places. It's real data. It wasn't made up. But it's only from a few places. It's not representative. It's not a good map. It's a map made from Washington and Kabul, not a map made of the society as a whole. I don't believe people in other parts of Afghanistan generally oppose the United States, but they didn't feel included. They didn't know what was going on. We didn't find a way to reach out to them. And if we couldn't reach out to them, then we shouldn't have been there. If we were going to be there, we'd have to reach out to them. We need a map that would connect ourselves to them. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the problem in the Middle East today as well. We have these maps that tell us where Syria is, where Iraq is, where Saudi Arabia is, where Jordan is. And we have been tyrannized by our own maps. We provide aid to the people who speak for those boundaries, right? It can be King of Jordan. It can be my least favorite people in the world, the Saudi royal family, right? I mean, this is a great gig they have, right? They take the oil from the ground. It's a family. It's a family operation, right? With about 95 princes, most of whom are above 80 of age, right? They take the oil from the ground. They don't let anyone become a citizen. They use the money. We provide them protection. They use their money to make themselves look like good Muslims by sponsoring extremists, and then we come in to protect them. It's a wonderful gig, isn't it? And we continue to do it. Why do we do it? Because they tell us, well, if you don't support us, it's going to be even worse. Well, it's going to be even worse because they've left no alternative, right? But because they are the rulers of Saudi Arabia, we think that's the way to work in Saudi Arabia. Because the king of Jordan is the ruler of Jordan, we work through him. We were trying this with Maliki in Iraq, right? We set up a government that was not representative, a government that was not competent, but because it was the government of Iraq and we wanted to get out, President Obama said, we're going to support this government so we can get out, even though this government is not actually doing what it needs to do to rule. That was known by everyone in Washington. There was nothing new that came of that. The maps tell us that we should support the governments on the maps, but they're not the reality of what's happening on the ground. A true map of this region would say that this area, the top, that's becoming its own state. Hopefully not an ISIS state. That the Kurds are in essence running their own state. That the reality, the maps are not keeping up with the reality. They're approximating the reality, as I said, but approximating it in distortive ways. How do I know that? We still write about this as Iraq and Syria. There is no Iraq and Syria anymore. They're gone. They're gone, right? Assad rules a segment of what was Syria. Certain rebels rule a different area, but yet we still talk about it as Syria and Iraq. We have not updated our thinking on these issues. Same thing with Ukraine. Same thing with Ukraine. There are deep tensions, historical tensions within this area. Ukraine was put together as a fiction to hold this space for Soviet authority at one point. I am completely against what Vladimir Putin is doing. I think we should take stronger measures against him. But I think we're also silly if we think that the anti-Putin position is some kind of eternal Ukraine. It's not. Where we started today, right? It's remaking itself in front of us. It's remaking itself in front of us. The challenge for us, the reason I've taken you through this long excursion, is because there are 5 Ps. Maps, like policy, have to be about more than just the tools policymakers ask for and more than just the technology itself. They have to dig deeper. We are a shallow society today because we are misusing our technology. We are not using what you offer to take us deeper. Good maps tell us who our partners are. They map the people on the ground. Good maps show a process of change. That's actually why this map was so interesting, right? Because it actually shows a process of change, right? Good maps show change. They're not static. They are used as static entities by policymakers too often. Good maps also provide some basis for thinking about problems. They have a purpose. Every map early on in this lecture had a purpose, right? It was made for a purpose to help get to a place. And maps fundamentally are about people. Too often, it's not the map maker's fault, so I'm not trying to blame you guys, nor the technologist's fault. It's how the maps are used. The maps change the way we think, but we're not always self-conscious of that. So my 2 takeaways for you are to use your technology, your knowledge, your technical know-how, not just to give policymakers what they think they want, but to help them think beyond what they think they want. Because they're often asking the questions that aren't the questions that need to be asked. And your maps can help them ask different questions. Second takeaway point is that your maps must be ever-changing. Ever-changing. You know that. But here's the problem. People get fixated on a particular way of doing things, fixated on a particular vision. We need, and I'm sure you've thought about this much more than I have, we need ways of thinking about continually updating our understanding of these issues. So my final point then, coming back to where we started, and I want to go back to this and then I will be quiet. My final point is a point I really wanted to hit home here. What made this generation extraordinary was not that they necessarily had better ideas than us, not that they were smarter. but they did a better job of understanding the world around them. Here's the paradox of our world today. We travel more, we have more data, we know less. We're less knowledgeable of the wider world. We're more insulated. I see that with my students every day. Last story I'll tell. My students travel overseas. They come back. It's great that they travel overseas. They come back. I ask them who they've met. More often than not, they've met other Americans overseas. They've heard from other Americans overseas, right? That's not our world. Our world has to be a world like theirs that is cosmopolitan, broad, and engaged with places far away. That's not going to happen just by traveling there. It's going to happen with better mapping of what there looks like. Thank you.
We actually have a couple of minutes for some questions, if you're okay with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, fire away. Anybody?
I think there's one
back there.
You're showing the map of the United States right after the war, and there's how do they decide the states that became square in the West, where most of them are defined by bodies?
Surveyors went out there and they just drew lines. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing. I mean, they were not political decisions. They were decisions made for expedience. And that's not just in the US. Why is the division between North and South Korea where it is? Well, the 38th parallel was chosen. It's now not quite that, but the 38th parallel after World War II was chosen because in the State Department they were looking for a neat place. That's why. Yes, sir. I think it's a very learned question you ask, right? There are different kinds of states over time, right? And the notion of a market state, right, is a state that's built around the interaction of different peoples and different goods. I think what's significant about that in terms of a mapping system is that it's not just about the political authority then. It has to be about economic authority. This map is a political map, right? But thinking about ways of capturing economic change, right, as I think what a market state would have. It does also change our identity. I think one of the problems we have in our society today is we have a government, but many people's identity, they don't see it overlapping with that government. They see it more in a market environment. And that's, I think, a failure of political leadership to connect those issues. But it's a big question with a lot more than that. I think that's where we can start to think about it. Yes, sir. I did. Of course, the more historians you hire, the better you'll be, right? All of your agencies know that, right? The truth is, to this day, still the institution that employs the most historians is the U.S. federal government. If you think about all the military historians, all the historians at the Smithsonian and elsewhere. But what is definitely true, what that article and others captured, was that there's much more of a currency placed in what economists can offer, because economists seem to be able to offer predictions, and they have a lot of quantitative data. And everyone, you guys see this as much as I do, right? Everyone is caught up with data, right? Big data. And historians tend to do qualitative work, not quantitative work. So there is a problem with that. I would also say that for too long, historians were uncomfortable in policy environments because they felt that that was a politically fraught environment to be in. Hopefully that's changed. That was a problem. But what I have found, because I do a fair amount of consulting for the government, is I found that there is a great deal of openness policymakers have, particularly principals, people who are the head of agencies and others. They are open to historical knowledge if it can be presented to them in a way that shows the past and its present relevance. They're open to that because they recognize the importance of that. I think what we need to find are more venues where that conversation can occur. Policymakers like economists, because economists can give them a 10-page paper that predicts the GNP. Historians, I can't in a 10-page paper predict what's going to happen in the world. But we can have a conversation about the history of the Middle East and American policy and the questions I would ask if I were historically informed making policy. I was just actually talking about this in Washington last week. That I think policymakers want, but it's more time consuming and it's less usable immediately. And so what I try to say to policymakers is you have to find space in your schedule to move outside of the tasks, the tactics you're doing every day, and think bigger. I think the biggest problem we have as a society is that we are crisis-driven. We are living in the immediate. We're not doing what's important. We're not thinking beyond the immediate crises that we face. Henry Kissinger, who I wrote a book about, said this very well. He said, most people in Washington, and I'm going to say most people in Austin, right, are doing the urgent, not the important. My view is the economists help you with the urgent, but the historians help you with the important, right? And you need to ask yourself if you're doing the important work. I tell people when I do executive education, find an hour every day to get beyond the crisis you're in. Successful policymakers I've studied, like Jim Baker and George Shultz, always did that. They found time to do more than just deal with the Ebola panic or deal with whatever the crisis is at the moment. And I think that's where historians can help. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like, since you talked about the relationship between history and economy, I'd like to ask you about, from your view as a historian, the relationship between history and geography. Many of us are geographers, and geography is a discipline that bridges the quantitative
Absolutely.
and qualitative. How do you see that?
You just think you're better, don't you? Anytime someone says they bridge, I'm worried. Where am I on your bridge? No, I think, and I hope that was clear here. I think geography is crucially important, and I, in a sense, I think there's a lot, particularly the cultural geography. I think you could sense that in my talk. Absolutely. And I think there's a lot. Cultural geography for me, you're more of an expert than I am, I'm sure others in the room, but I read cultural geography because I think what cultural geography does is it helps us understand how people are actively defining the geography around them as it's defining them. It's back and forth. And that's how I think about particularly our society. I mean, what the point I was making here was a cultural geography point, right? That the founding of our society is linked to a particular territory. It's a material geography, but it's also culturally redefining who we are as we're redefining what it is. When we go from calling it unsettled territory into calling it democratic territory, right? I think that's a crucial way to think about things, and I think geographical knowledge has to be at the foundation of what we do. So I'm going to say what you know even better than I do, which is that one of the real failings in our society is people don't know the basic geography. And I mean policymakers, I don't just mean students. I find in Washington it's crazy how little people know the geography of other places. And that's something we really need to address. I'm hoping, I'm an idealist, that technology will make geography cool. You know, and my kids will want to learn more about geography because of the Google Earth thing and whatever else. Yes, sir?
If you go back to the graph of the nation state.
Sure. Where is it? There we go.
Where do you see the kind of curve of this? I mean, as far as the future trends?
Yeah, good question. I'm afraid it's going the other way.
Right.
I'm afraid it's going the other way. And I think we're at a moment, this is a whole other lecture, but I think we're at a moment where we have to rethink what political order looks like. And we have to rethink what our role is in it. I don't think it's going to go back down to where it was, but I think we're going into a world, and it connects to the point about geography, where there's going to be more political diversity in line with the greater geographical diversity and economic diversity that we live in, right? The world became more homogeneous, in part because of our power, and in part because we supported that happening, particularly in the 20th century, right? I mean, this big jump there is decolonization and post-World War II, right? It's going the other way now. It's going the other way now. And so we need to be able to adjust to more different kinds of actors. And we need to strengthen our nation state. I think that's really the issue here. This is not an argument for isolation, it's an argument for engagement, but engagement realistic of what's going to happen. Asia is not going to look like Europe in the next century. That doesn't mean it's going to be at war, but it's not going to look like Europe. And China is not running a nation state in the way we think of it. China's running a party business, right? That's what they're running, right? And so we need to be ready to adjust to a more diverse space. That, coming back to the prior question, is why we need history, because economics won't help with that. Economists aggregate everything. I want us to disaggregate. Good cultural geography disaggregates. Let's recognize there are going to be different kinds of systems, and we better learn how to manage that. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
So I'll let you call on the last one then, Rich.
Gentleman in the back.
Yes. Yeah, so what happened thank you for, I should have said more about this. So what happened after World War II was Germany was actually divided into 4 zones. Soviet zone, American zone, British zone, and French zone, okay? And the US zone, as I tell my students, the US zone was the Mercedes and BMW zone. It was Bavaria, right? No, who built their factories? Us, right? We were the ones who built their factories after the war. They were there beforehand, but we rebuilt them. That's actually why they get to where they are after the war, right? We give them a start. So we're in that zone. The French have the zone appropriately that's closer to the French border, right? Near Frankfurt and elsewhere. Up north is where the British are, and then the Soviets have their zone, East Germany. The 3 Western zones get consolidated, particularly in 1948 when they create a common currency for the Western zone called the Deutsche Mark. Some of you might remember the Deutsche Mark, right? That's created so that there's a common economy there. And very early on, there's a movement to make that Western zone closer to France and Belgium, and that's the coal and steel union. American money encourages that. We encourage the currency, we build the factories, and we help create this coal zone. And in essence, we're redrawing the map because the East is left out. Now again, I want to reiterate, we actually offered the East money too. When I'm in Russia, people will often say to me, well, you never offered us help. That's nonsense. We offered them help too. We kind of knew they wouldn't take it. So you get a different mapping based on the capitalist democratic economies and the communist economies. And I would argue that map, in a sense, still exists in Europe. It's moved, the western part has moved farther east. But what Vladimir Putin is fighting is to protect an alternative Europe, as he sees it. That's really what this is about. Don't get this wrong, right? It's not really about Ukraine. Putin does not want all of Europe to look like the West. He thinks that's bad for him. And so that's what he's fighting for. So this map and this legacy of the US zone, I think, still carries on in that sense.
Dr. Suri, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Great questions.
Oh, yeah. Are you going to be